Okay, let's get started. Before we begin, I'd like to ask everybody to go to we have 3 translation rooms at the bottom of the screen. There's one for English, one for Spanish, and one for Arabic. Please make sure that you're in the appropriate room for yourself so that you can understand the hearing. So my name is Nina Farnia. I'm the co-chair of the International People's Tribunal on U.S. Imperialism, Sanctions, Blockades, and Economic Coercive Measures, along with Helia Dotari, who you'll hear from later today. It is my honor and privilege to welcome our witnesses and our jurors to today's hearing. We will be hearing today from people who successfully won a revolution against US imperialism. And it was a difficult revolution to win. And they since have built a society liberated from all the harms that the US has imposed on the world. So we'll be learning not just about what the US has done, but also how they built the society that they've wanted. They are truly an inspiration to us, and it's our honor to host them today. I'd like to thank and introduce some people as well before we begin. So as I said earlier, Helia will be my co-moderator. Charlotte Cates has been handling all the tech for us today, and she'll also be handling any problems that come up later, hopefully none. And she's also a juror. We have 2 translators who will be, well, we have 3 translators actually, who will be translating English, Spanish, and Arabic: Jill Clark Golub, Niels McCoon, and Ali Fakhr. And then I want to send a heartfelt greetings and thanks to Colleen Littlejohn and our friends in Sanctions Kill, who really helped put this hearing together. It would not have been possible without them. I also want to remind everybody that next weekend we will have our Cuba hearing. And this will be, we've had two-day hearings, Cuba and Eritrea. Cuba will be a 2-day hearing as well, and it will also be an excellent hearing. I encourage you all to join. If you'd like to register, you can go to sanctionstribunal.org. And there you can also see the bios of our wonderful jurors who are here today with us: Michael Deutsch, Eva Nanopoulos, Prabhat Patnaik, Jari Buhil, Mohammed Tay, Edre Olalia, Marjorie Cohn, Susanna Daly, Bruce Nestor, Jeannie Meyer, and as I said earlier, Charlotte Cates, and also Victor Good is here. Our jurors today are joining us from all around the world, from time zones that are quite late in the night right now. So we thank them very much for joining us. So with that, I will get us started. We're going to hear initially from a round of speakers who will each be speaking for a few minutes on this will be the testimony of historic members of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the FSLN. And they'll each speak for a few minutes, and then I'll introduce our next speakers. Our first speaker will be Amada Pineda Montenegro, who's the retired magistrate of the Supreme Electoral Council from 1984 to 1990. Our next speaker will be Brenda Rocha, president of the Supreme Electoral Council of Nicaragua, followed by Alma Nubia Baltodano, the magistrate of the Supreme Electoral Council, and then Orlando Tardencia, a lawyer and the former ambassador of Nicaragua in Geneva and the OAS. So without further ado, I will pass on the mic.
Así que, adelante.
I have been a deputy to the National Assembly of Nicaragua and send you warm and fraternal greetings from Nicaragua, which is free, sovereign, and blessed. My testimony is that in 1965, the National Guard of Nicaragua took me as prisoner. And I was beaten, tortured, and raped. And this happened to all of our brothers and sisters, comrades who were captured by the National Guard. We were tortured, beaten, and this also happened to our comrade peasants. They were killed and thrown out of helicopters and disappeared. This is how they killed a bunch of our comrades, pregnant women, children, and young people as well. I was not held prisoner for that long, only 10 days, but during those 10 days, it felt like 10 years. I was captured in 1974 by the National Guard. When I got out of jail, I was all bruised, inflamed, and I had to go to a doctor. And this is the same thing that happened with all of the peasant brothers and sisters. Later, during the insurrection, they killed a bunch of peasants, and including my older son, Armengol. And they killed a lot of people, too many people, peasants and non-peasants, students, all kinds of people. All that has happened to us is true. We have to understand everything that we went through. And then 5 years ago, in April 18th, they killed another one of my sons. He was burned and tortured and killed. This was very painful to me. And I feel that this has been too much, because the first one was killed in June of 1979, and the other one on June 16th of 2018. And I feel that those things shouldn't happen. Now that we have our president, Compañero Daniel, and Compañera Rosario, we have overcome so many things. We have hospitals, we have schools, all of our children are in school. They aren't just wandering in the streets. Some people don't want to go to school and they don't, but whoever wants to go to school can go to school. There are jobs. We have everything. It is very hard for me, ladies and gentlemen, to appear before you and tell you about everything that has happened here in Nicaragua. When the Somozas were here, and now when they tried to have that coup d'etat, so many deaths, so many lives. It's as if we went back in time. Our economy suffered a setback because they burned everything. They did so many barbarous acts. We will not put up with that anymore. And now, under Compañero Daniel and Compañera Rosario, this is the only president who has done anything for our country. I would like to tell you to please take everything that we say here into consideration. You should not listen to those who want to snatch everything away from us, all of the progress that we have made and what we have now. It's been too much. Nicaragua can't stand it anymore. And the coup mongers, those people, we want them to leave and stop bothering us here. We're fine here. We have everything here. whoever doesn't have a job, it's because they don't want to work, but there are jobs. So forgive me. It's very hard for me to say all this. But I do believe that we are going to continue to forge ahead with our president, and hopefully God will give me more life and enough health, give him enough life and health to continue to govern Nicaragua, because there are very few men who can do what he has done for our country. Thank you. Good morning, brothers and sisters of the International People's Tribunal. First of all, I wish to thank you for this opportunity to let people know about the acts of aggression that we, the people of Nicaragua, have experienced throughout our history from the government of the United States, as it tries to subjugate us and violate our sovereignty and our dignity. My name is Brenda Isabel Rocha Chacon, and I am from the region of Bonanza in the autonomous region of the North Caribbean coast, which is a municipality engaged in gold extraction. We have the presidents of Mayagna, Miskito, Mestizo, and Afro-descendant populations. This municipality includes communities on the border with Honduras. One of them is the community of Musawas. Along this border in the 1980s, counter-revolutionary groups had been formed, made up of former Somoza National Guardsmen. They had camps and weapons financed by the government of the United States. In 1982, when I was 15 years old, I joined the popular militias in order to defend our municipality, our homeland, from the constant attacks along the border. And we never knew when they might come to attack our town of Bonanza, thanks to the war imposed by the government of the United States. On a Saturday, July 24th, 1982, 8 of us militia members were present at the Salto Grande Dam in the municipality of Bonanza. We were protecting that hydroelectric dam that generated electricity for our town. Cristina Rugamo, Rene Hoy Diaz, Aristides Cruz Rugama, Lázaro Ochoa, Ramon Mendiola, Jose Senon, Aaron Toledo, and myself were all there. Rene Hoy, with his rifle over his shoulder, shouted out 2222, which was our signal to go to our trenches. And we evacuated the community into the community's chapel, and we took our positions in the trenches. It was 5:30 in the evening on July 24th, 1982, when the battle started. It was a foggy, sad afternoon. More than 100 armed men were fighting against 8 militia members defending the hydroelectric dam. They killed us one by one. They screamed at us to surrender. No one surrendered. They fully surrounded us. First, they shot me in the legs. I felt an ugly heat throughout my body. Then they hit my right arm. At that time, I turned over onto my back and looked at my right hand, which was all covered in blood, and I couldn't move it. And so I adjusted myself face up, and then all of a sudden I heard an explosion, and it was a grenade that they threw on Mr. Lázaro and Aristides, completely blowing them apart. They came down because they hadn't killed all of us yet, and they finished killing us, mutilating the bodies. They had camouflaged uniforms, were well armed, and they screamed, "We killed them, we killed them." And when they came close to me, I was totally covered in blood. And what I did was to hold my breath and act like I was dead. They kicked the bodies, they kicked me, my whole body hurt when they kicked me. But then I heard them scream that reinforcements were coming, so they began walking towards the river. When I saw them pass in front of me with Aaron Toledo, another one of our militia members who was 15 years old, just like me at that time. Later on, we found him. He had been stripped naked and was tortured and dead. They left towards Musawas, crossing once again back over the border with Honduras. I stayed there quietly with fear that they would return. I don't know whether I fainted and came back, but I was thirsty and I began to drag myself on the side. The community saw me and they gave me first aid and later transferred me to the hospital in Bonanza and later to a hospital in Managua, where I was given medical care. At the Managua hospital, they did everything possible to save my right arm. I had 14 holes in me, but they were not able to save my arm. It had to be amputated. And the doctors tried to explain why they had made the decision to cut off or amputate my right arm. It was to save my life. I just told the doctors that my arm is a small sacrifice compared to the lives of those other 7 comrades whom I saw suffer and die. I was the only one left alive. And I saw each one of them die. That is pain that has stayed with me for so many years because it hurts. It hurts. Those comrades, and as a woman, I saw a woman die there. They all left behind their mothers, their families, just because they were trying to defend our homeland, our municipality, the strategic point that we had, which was what gave light and energy to our people, more than 100 well-armed men against 8 people. Here I am to give testimony for those 6 men and 1 woman who died thanks to a war imposed, a damaging war that was unjust against our people who love peace, and we're defending that peace. Thank you very much. Good morning, participants in this International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism in Nicaragua. I will now give testimony as a victim of the war imposed by the Somoza dynasty, which for over 40 years had the unconditional support of the United States government to impose the U.S. policy of America for the Americans, as stated in the Monroe Doctrine. Given what was imposed on us by the gringos and the support for the Somocista dynasty, the people of Nicaragua rose up. And upon seeing the opposition of the workers, peasants, and students, the Somoza forces unleashed a wave of repression against the lives of citizens. This repression was imposed through a significant increase in the police and military forces, the creation of jails, persecution, kidnappings, and torture imposed by the National Guard. This was the context in which thousands of families and young people came to support the struggle against the dynasty. And that is the struggle that led us to participate directly through different ways. The war against Somoza left more than 50,000 war victims. There were hundreds of thousands of families that were left homeless or had to become refugees. I would like to provide my testimony as to how I lost my hands. It was about 5 in the afternoon, and I was in a house in the Monseñor Lescano neighborhood of Managua. It was about 1 hour until the curfew went into effect on April 12th, 1979. There were more than 5 of us kids, all of us teenagers, in a room of a house. At that time, I was 16 years old. And as was happening in many other houses, we were preparing contact bombs. This was a common activity at that time. It was a way for all citizens to contribute to the fight against the dictatorship. It was Thursday of Holy Week when a clicking sound announced the tragedy. It only gave me time to warn my comrades that the bomb was going to go off. The next thing I remember is that I got up from a bed surrounded by a cloud of smoke. I felt like I was in a bubble. I don't remember the pain. I was only hearing the silence until I began to see the horrified faces of my friends. I no longer had hands. The bomb that I was putting together had exploded. Some slight friction within the device had set off a spark that caused the explosion. At that time, when we young people posed a danger to the government, people who were involved in activities like putting together contact bombs were called by pseudonyms in order to protect us from any snitches. My pseudonym was Sylvia. This had been chosen for me, and I continued to use it until I got to the hospital where I received care, which is currently where the Bertha Calderon Hospital is. And they registered me as Sylvia, but my mom came in asking about me with my real name, and nobody paid any attention to her. But I heard her, and I just called out, "I'm alive." I was hospitalized for 2 days. Could not stay. One of the doctors whispered to me that I had to leave because the National Guard was coming. I remember that one doctor came up to me and said, "You know that you have to leave, right? You can't stay here." With my arms still bandaged up, and with my legs seriously injured, and with the help of a relative, I was able to leave the hospital and go into a safe house. Time has passed and the wounds have healed. But before I had even had a chance to recover, my sister Zulema Bantodano, 17 years of age, was murdered 3 months later. This was on June 15th of 1979 during the Bataola massacre on June 15th, 1979. At that time, Somoza's National Guard killed more than 150 young people from different neighborhoods near the Bataola plant next to the US Embassy. 50 caliber machine guns and heavy caliber rockets, as well as tanks and war vehicles, were used indiscriminately for that terrible act of hatred against Nicaraguan youth. Their bodies were transferred in bulldozers, and any who were still alive were killed then. They took their belongings from them and threw them into various common graves. This is my evidence of what happened in the different parts of our country during the struggle against the Somoza dynasty. Thank you.
Good morning, dear sisters and brothers of this important International People's Tribunal. Good morning, sisters and brothers who are here today with us, giving testimony on behalf of the Nicaraguan people. Good morning to all of you who accompany us My name is Orlando Jose Tardencilla, now an elder, married, a lawyer in the Republic of Nicaragua. I sit before you with the conviction to share a few small details of the infinite set of acts, and events that Nicaraguans have confronted and that the Monroe Doctrine has developed against our country in a crucial era of the life of our nation. To begin with, in the final battles of the forces of the people of Nicaragua to liberate themselves from the Somoza tyranny, together with thousands of youth and adults, which also included important contingents of children, around 1977, I participated as just another citizen looking for the roads of life in those very difficult years. More than 50,000 people had been killed, many injured and displaced from their territories, motivated by the gigantic rebellion against the Somoza army, which had been put together and financed by the government of the US and other countries. The unstoppable strength of the unity of our people, international solidarity denouncing the North American barbarity that was carried out through the National Guard of Somoza, and the life conviction of the Nicaraguans allowed that from our convictions and Christian faith, we could defeat the Somoza army. New horizons were opened with hope in those first days of July and August of '79. Many young people got involved in the tasks of reconstruction, literacy campaigns, building cooperatives, and all the other tasks that this new life implied, the new life in liberty. We developed sports, culture, and other activities. Around March 1980, we were deeply shaken by the assassination of the Monsignor of the Poor in El Salvador. And this deed motivated our thoughts to integrate me into the liberatory struggles that the Salvadoran people, the heroic Salvadoran people, had already started. From the depth of my convictions, I integrated myself in the struggle in El Salvador, and with them, I shared the sacrifices of the struggle during nearly a year. In January 1981, in an action of combat, I was wounded and I was captured, and I was held during more than a year in different kinds of centers of torture, isolation, and mistreatment. The actions used by experts in this kind of torturous activities have been already broadly documented by thousands of reports, which also shows the effect that these have upon the many victims. In my case, I don't need to repeat that during more than a year, I lived the most bitter and painful experiences of a prisoner of war in El Salvador. Around the middle of the month of February in 1982, and under the pressure of death threats, they asked me, would you like to be the last dead in a war that's already been lost? They sent me to the United States. A group of North American soldiers and agents sent me to the United States. I was sent from my cell in the federal police jail towards the Comalapa airport. And I can't describe the details of this because I was hooded and I was laid down on the floor of a military vehicle. 2 days before this unhoped for trip, I was finally tortured and threatened, telling me that in order to save my life and become free and to have the opportunity to work for them, I should speak before a committee of the Senate of the United States and the Commission of Foreign Relations of the U.S. Congress to say that I was part of a combat unit and penetration of the Sandinista and Cuban revolutions in the war in El Salvador, in which I was supposed to state that there would be military procedures and commanders of the Nicaraguan army carrying out tasks in different kinds of arming that were supposedly being sent from Nicaragua to El Salvador. my job would be to identify the supposed routes that were used. In this process of training and assurance, I was trained for several days. I learned sometime later that this all happened in houses in the area around Langley, the United States. The death threats and the interrogations were constant, and occasionally the proposals of freedom and a comfortable life in the United States. In the Department of State and before Dean Fisher, the spokesperson of the Department of State, and other high-level members of the commissions of the Congress and the Senate of the United States, and journalists, the 12th of March of 1982, almost certain that it was a real conference, I denounced the U.S. Deceitful policy towards Nicaragua, Cuba, and El Salvador, and I directly mentioned the tortures, the threats, and the pressure that I had suffered in order to tell lies against our peoples. The conference went in live to the world, and that allowed the revolutionary government and the efforts of solidarity there in the United States to pressure for my freedom, which was achieved some days later. In Nicaragua, there's a strong fight to save my life. And thanks to the pressure and the effort of the revolutionary government of Commander Daniel Ortega, through the Nicaraguan Foreign Ministry, Miguel de Escoto Brockman at the head of it, and international solidarity there in the United States, in the dawn of March 13th, I was turned in to the same Department of State, to our diplomatic agents accredited and moved to the Nicaraguan embassy. Over the course of March 13th, my comrades accompanied me. Together with U.S. agents, took me to Mexico, where I was liberated, receiving the hugs and protection of my friend and ambassador, Aldo Diaz-Lacayo. Those who mentioned before me here at this table, all this happened when we were very young. I was 19 or 20 when I suffered all this. In the end, to be exact, March 12th, is where they took me from where I had been held in these houses to be trained to lie. They took me in the ride to the offices of Dean Fisher, who was the spokesperson for the State Department, and in a broad conference room where there were people from the U.S. Congress and a specialist committee from the Senate, as well as Dean Fisher himself and some journalists. They started a press conference in which my job was to state in an ordered way all the ways. This is where I spoke out. I spoke out about all the ways that I had been pressured, tortured, and threatened in order to speak bad about the Nicaraguan government and make these accusations. This is true. It's painful. It's painful, particularly when the truth for which people struggle. And that's why in that conference, I spoke with absolute clarity that I was a victim of the international aggression against El Salvador. I was a victim of physical aggression, of torture, victim of kidnapping and a beating carried out by functionaries of the Department of State and functionaries of El Salvador. And when I was sent to the United States, those who held me in these houses to train me to speak these lies based on my participation in the revolutionary struggle in El Salvador. That afternoon, as you can imagine, I had a very tough time after that conference. I was taken back to that home where I had been trained to lie. it's hard to describe the hate that they felt towards me at that time, aside from the physical violence. Here in Nicaragua and in the United States itself, there was an extraordinary effort to save my life. I didn't know about that at the time. I learned about it later. The solidarity movements there in the United States, including in Washington, D.C., as well as the Nicaraguan government, with our president, Daniel Ortega, who coordinated the government council, and Miguel de Escoto Brockman, who also carried out an extraordinary effort with the solidarity community in the United States to rescue me from these people who were basically planning my last days through the torture and the beatings that I was receiving. The next day at dawn, they took me back to the Department of State, and I was turned into the diplomatic corps of the Nicaraguan government. And they took me back to the Nicaraguan embassy, where I was able to speak with our authorities. And we spoke about through the steps that would be taken, in addition to the work of different U.S. government agents, by which they sent me to Mexico, where I received an important hug from the friend and ambassador Aldo Diaz Lacayo, who was the ambassador to Mexico at that time. With his protection, as well as that of a group of comrades, I was able to return back to Nicaragua, arriving on the 15th of March. In addition to the comrades who were witnesses, those who sit with me here today, who were frontline witnesses of this war of aggression, an open war of aggression that was opening against Nicaragua at that time. I'm talking about March of '82. Shortly thereafter, the attacks against the bridges in Chinandega began, and the so-called Contra War began, which lasted 8.5 or 9 years, but Nicaragua was able to defeat the Contras, was able to triumph through the liberating acts that Nicaraguans practiced in our infinite faith in God and justice. I've come here today to share this small testimony with you in faith that the honor of Nicaraguans, especially those who sacrificed their lives for our freedom, should be respected, but also the commandment that Nicaraguans and their right to be free and sovereign should be respected. Our dignity as a people, our dignity as human beings who live in this planet. 1,000 thanks to this tribunal, 1,000 thanks to those who are with us, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you all very, very much for the powerful testimonies. 1,000 thanks to you all for showing us what it takes to win. Thank you very, very much. And long live the revolution and the people's victory. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to welcome Jaime Hermida, Nicaraguan ambassador to the United Nations, and Yasser Jimenez, Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations. They're joining us from the audience. So welcome, Jaime and Yasser. Our next speaker, it is my honor to introduce, is the Second Secretary of the National Assembly and the President of the Constitutional Liberal Independent Party, Wilfredo Navarro. He's also a lawyer. He'll be speaking about the history of illegal US aggressions against Nicaragua from the times of William Walker to the present.
Good day. My name is Wilfredo Navarro. I'm a congressperson in Nicaragua. My respectful greetings from the Nicaraguan people to the members of this International People's Tribunal, and to those of you who I share the message of denouncing and calling for the denouncing of the interventions of the United States in our country, and reiterating the right to live free without aggression in a world of sisterhood and brotherhood and equality for all. Throughout the history of our country, Nicaragua has been the object by the United States of occupations, interventions, sanctions, political aggression, commercial aggression, economic aggression, financing and training of mercenaries, blockades, minings of our ports, terrorism, and every other kind of sabotage. It's important to remember this key fact. The United States has attacked over 400 times different countries of the world since its independence in 1776. Roughly half of these invasions and interventions were carried out between 1950 and 2019, and 25% of them after the end of the Cold War. This shows very clearly that this country has an imperial spirit. Nicaragua being a poor country, the sanctions of the United States make our development difficult and put in danger the life of the most vulnerable part of our population, children, women, elders, and affects the effort that we are carrying out in our country to reduce poverty and confront the challenges of the future. United Nations has declared that all the coercive unilateral measures are illegal because they punish a population based on disagreements between governments. And it's been shown that sanctions cause suffering and death across the world and are a form of economic war. Those who suffer their impact are the most poor and the most vulnerable. And just like military aggressions, economic aggressions are used to defeat governments that do not respond to the interests of the invader. These aggressions include, as we have said here, invasions, filibuster invasions, the imposition of puppet governments, financing of dictatorships, mercenary armies, blockades, embargoes, and economic war, etc., etc., etc. In the case of Nicaragua, United States has gotten to the maximum of political paradox, declaring our country an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security and foreign policy. What threat could Nicaragua possibly be for the United States if the Nicaraguan expense in military expenses is not even $70 million, while the U.S. military spending is over $800 billion in 2022, which is 39% of the global military spending, being the highest of the world, 3 times more than that spent by China, which is the second highest spending in military. It's been more than a century and a half of threats and torments of all kinds. Nicaragua is a historical victim of all of the aggressions of the United States. We've been the target of its intervention in a practically permanent way. And let's start in 1854 with the gold rush in California. Europeans and adventurers chose the Nicaraguan route to get to the city of San Francisco. Cornelius Vanderbilt, U.S. partner of Alexander Knox, the Secretary of State of the United States, pressured Nicaragua to give him a concession to cross Nicaragua, and he created a transit company. After that moment, they never lost the goal of an interoceanic canal that would cross our country. After that year, the Nicaragua government tried to force a Vanderbilt boat to pay taxes. The result of that was that the United States Navy bombed the port city of San Juan del Sur. That's how the U.S. resolves problems. The U.S. Army imposes its will on sovereign countries, guaranteeing the interests of U.S. companies, punishing sovereign countries. In the midst of a civil war in our country, based on the interests of Cornelius Vanderbilt, there was a filibuster invasion by William Walker, empowered by the banking interests of the United States. William Walker, a symbol of the manifest destiny principles of the United States, a slave owner from the South, wanted to create slave states outside of the United States. In Nicaragua, shortly after he arrived, William Walker named himself president of Nicaragua, hoping to make Nicaragua another state of the United States. He, through a scorched earth policy, he stormed different cities of Nicaragua, declaring English the official language, controlling the movement of steamships of the San Juan River, and bringing more mercenaries into Nicaragua. The government of the United States of that time, with the president Franklin Pierce, supported the actions of Walker and recognized him as president of Nicaragua. Finally, the support of the Nicaraguans, of the Central American governments that came to the support of Nicaragua, and when he tried to leave, he was killed in Honduras. In 1854, U.S. ships intervened in Bluefields in order supposedly to protect U.S. interests, but in reality, it was to protect one of the sides in an internal conflict in the country. In 1909, the nationalist government of Jose Santos Zelaya, judged 2 U.S. mercenaries of participating in armed actions within Nicaragua, and the famous Knox Note was sent to Nicaragua, which claimed the rights of the United States to intervene militarily in the United States and threatened an invasion. Under the threat of intervention, Jose Santos Zelaya left power. But it's important to say that the president of the United States in that time let President Zelaya know that the cause of the United States was to turn Rio San Juan into an interoceanic canal and the creation of a U.S. naval base in Fonseca Gulf. And that pressure, the United States installed a puppet government of the United States. The gringos came back to our country once again to support the weakened government that had been imposed by the United States, and which was represented by the puppet Adolfo Diaz. And different agreements were signed that meant the settling of U.S. hegemony in Nicaragua, extending later to the rest of Central America, which was considered to be highly important to U.S. interests. This occupation of Nicaragua lasted until 1925, because the United States provided the military force to guarantee internal stability, guaranteeing that Nicaragua would function as a protectorate of the United States. President Taft, in these moments, said, "The day is not far when the 3 stars and stripes at 3 equidistant points will mark our territory, one at the North Pole, another at Panama Canal, and the third at the South Pole. The whole hemisphere will be ours, in fact, as, by virtue of our superiority of race, it already is ours morally." The Nicaraguan governments that were installed by the United States gave all economic interests to Wall Street. They gave financial sector, the state control, creating and giving over mechanisms by which the Nicaraguan government would receive loans from the United States in order to maintain the government, but particularly to maintain its debt payments to the United States. In exchange for those loans, 51% of the railroad actions, 51% of the National Bank, the control of customs, and tax income was administered by a special commission created, including 2 North Americans, a representative of the United States and the other a representative of the bankers of New York, and another of Nicaraguan, who was the minister of the economy. This concession decided how much to spend, what to spend on, and who to pay based on decisions by the United States. In summary, they would first pay U.S. bankers and debt owners for any kind of loss or harm, and what was left over would be used to pay the national budget. Practically, as a Nicaraguan writer wrote, the country was an intervened country with no life of its own, no strength of its own, no decisions of its own in its economy and its finances, in its governments and its military. It was a government without a personality. Those who directed the government and national policy solved internal issues of the country was the U.S. ambassador in Managua. All Nicaraguan national policy was in the hands of the big brother of the North. 1912, the country is completely occupied by U.S. Marines, with warships docked in Corina port. There's an armed resistance of many Nicaraguan patriots. And finally, in October, the national hero Benjamin Celedon is killed by U.S. Marines. After that, the puppet government of the United States is consolidated. 1914, Emiliano Chamorro as ambassador in Washington and Adolfo Diaz as the puppet president of Nicaragua sign on to the international agreement imposed by the United States the Chamorro-Bryan Agreement, signed in Washington, D.C. in 1914. Woodrow Wilson was the U.S. president. Through this agreement, Nicaragua ceded full rights for the construction and maintenance of an interoceanic canal without owing any taxes or fees to the Nicaraguan government. This agreement also offered the Caribbean islands, Corn Island and Little Corn Island, for 95 years to the United States. And finally, as the icing on the cake, it gave the U.S. military the right to create naval bases anywhere in Nicaragua. This created a Nicaragua that was completely occupied by U.S. Marines. 1926, the Marines remained in the country all the way to 1925, but as they stayed, there were a new set of armed actions against the puppet governments. And so the Marines came back just 1 year later in 1926 to control the situation. The triumphing liberal revolution, directed by Jose Maria Moncada, before the fear that the United States would freeze its triumph, signs an agreement with the United States guaranteeing the presidency, but allowing for the conclusion of the presidency through an illegal manner of a conservative leader who was an ally of the United States. With this betrayal of the triumphant liberal revolution, there's a rising up of the leader of free women and men, Augusto Sandino, who does not agree to these agreements and rises up in arms against the occupying U.S. Marines. For the U.S. Marines, it turns out to be impossible to defeat Sandino in the mountains of the country. So they're forced to leave, but before they leave, they create and train a military force in the country called the National Guard. Sandino is brought into Managua to sign an agreement of peace once the U.S. leaves, and Sandino, in agreement with Arturo Bruce Lane, the ambassador of the United States in Nicaragua, assassinates Sandino and orders the elimination of the army, defending army of national sovereignty, which had been organized by General Sandino. The Marines finally left Nicaragua in 1933, but left in their representation the Somoza dynasty and their National Guard, which were the last Marines in Nicaragua. It's important to recognize that Somoza Garcia had studied in the United States, spoke English, was close with the wife of the U.S. ambassador, and was the unconditional friend of the United States, which meant that the submission to the empire continued and allowed Somoza Garcia to allow an extraordinary influence of the United States in Central America. In 1979, the dictatorship of the Somozas maintained until 1979 and falls apart under the avalanche of popular participation in revolutionary struggle in 1979. But the United States could never bear Sandinista revolution. And so under President Jimmy Carter, there's the beginning of sabotage, which first through diplomatic and economic means. Then came Ronald Reagan, and the war and violence was the chosen path. For 8 years, Nicaragua was attacked by the Contras, which was the army that was created by the United States out of the disintegrated National Guard of Somoza. They carried out a cruel war of sabotage, terrorism, mining and bombing the entire country. In 1983, the escalation and aggression of the United States with the Contra grows through destructive actions and sophisticated military action, including the intervention of, in some places, of US Marines. With sophisticated means, the possibility of bringing petroleum into the country at the ports was damaged. The CIA gives planes and arms to the Contra and directly takes on the commanding role in sabotage operations. The infrastructure of the port in Carinto is deeply damaged, carried out by the CIA with US mercenaries. 1983 to 88, the Nicaraguan government and army shoot down 14 planes of the Contra, which were provided by the CIA. Eugene Hassenfuss was shot down alive and confessed to being a mercenary. And much of the infrastructure is damaged in the effort to militarily and economically destroy the Nicaraguan people. 1984, Nicaragua sues the United States to the International Court of Justice of The Hague based on its support for the Contra. The court in 1985 rules in favor of Nicaragua 15-1 and demands that the United States pay damages to Nicaragua. $17 billion at that time. Today, the Minister of Finances says that would be $50 billion. The United States never wanted to recognize this sentence, this decision of the International Court of Justice, this ruling. But this ruling establishes for the first time the obligation of the completion of the no intervention policy, the non-use of force, and the respect of different peoples. 1985, the war of aggression continues. The United States decrees an embargo against Nicaragua in the mining of the ports and waters of the country, actions that are carried out directly by US military. The Iran-Contra scandal erupts, which shows that the CIA was sending arms to Iran, violating the United Nations embargo against Iran, and with those dividends financed the Contras. In this way, the CIA also was able to finance arms through cocaine sales, and through that was able to finance the Contra. We can never forget that the criminal intervention of the United States against Nicaragua caused more than 50,000 dead, millions of injured, and profound damages against the economy of our country. And we've built ourselves back up since then. In 1990, presidential elections, the opposition to the FSLN wins. This opposition received directly the full support of the United States in the economic sense, in the technical sense, in the logistical sense, and through the interventions of the CIA and other US agencies. They developed an international campaign and internal in the country to take away the prestige of the FSLN. 2006 to 2018, the Sandinista Front takes back power after triumphing in the national elections of 2006. The United States restarts its aggressions against the country. The opposition financed by the United States tries to destabilize the economy and use fear against the Nicaraguans. Since 2018, we have the NICA Act, the Renacer Law. These are economic sabotage through sanctions. There's been sanctions against individuals through the emergency 1381, which says Nicaragua is an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security. Also, Nicaragua has been cut off from monies from international organizations, in addition to reiterated votes in the U.S. Congress asking for more sanctions against Nicaragua. 2018, the United States financed, promoted, and carried out a failed coup attempt that caused grave damage to the national economy and to human beings through NGOs that they used to launder money. They sent millions of dollars into the United States to use social media to spread lies, to create a false sensation of chaos, destabilization, and terror. Roadblocks were established across the country in towns and cities, which were called by the population the roadblocks of death, which were used to try to paralyze the country. They carried out additionally, outside of the country, a campaign of disinformation, lies, and fallacies. In this failed coup attempt, the terrorists, financed by the United States, destroyed schools, hospitals, health centers, mayor offices, the destruction of public buildings in order to create a society in disorder, in order to defeat the government. It's important to mention that these roadblocks were nests of violations, of torture, of violence. All of this financed, coordinated, and supervised by the United States and its intelligence organizations. And the aggression continues, and the sanctions continue until today. For all of what I've said, I think this is a century and a half of aggression, of manipulation by the United States against Nicaragua. This is a historic testimony in which many things that we tried to do. We couldn't tell the full story, but this is just to give a pixelized vision of the hatred that the United States government has carried out against Nicaraguan people. This history of aggression of the United States against Nicaragua include undisputable proof of this aggression. And that's why today I come before this international tribunal of the people to denounce and accuse and ask for the condemnation of this tribunal of the United States government for the damages to my country through invasions, occupations, and sabotage of over 1 century and a half. And I would like to end my testimony today and call for condemnation with a phrase by Carlos Fonseca Amador, founder of the Sandinista Front, who had a clear idea of intervention and imperialism of the United States in his time, and said, together with the raiding of the national wealth, the United States proposes to take out its delights of the geographical advantages of Nicaragua, just as it does against other countries of the Americas. Many thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Compañero Navarro, for that excellent history and testimony. And I'll just add that the introduction of crack cocaine into Black neighborhoods in the United States devastated those communities, and it was all to fund this war. It is now my honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Alba Luz Ramos, President of the Supreme Court of Nicaragua. For folks who don't know, Nicaragua is one of the winningest nations, if not the winningest nations, in in international courts against challenging US imperialism. And we're going to hear some of that story today. She's going to discuss the 1984 case of Nicaragua against the US in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and the legacy of Father Miguel Descoto, Marino priest, and Nicaraguan foreign minister from 1980 to 88, and president of the UN National Assembly in 1989. As we conclude the tribunal in a few weeks and begin to embark on our own research and plans to file litigation, we will be looking to the work of Nicaragua and Dr. Ramos. So with that, I pass the podium on to you, Dr. Ramos. Thank you very much for joining us.
Very good morning, and thank you very much. Cordial greetings to the members and jurors of the International People's Tribunal, and I thank you for the importance of the work that you do. To start, I want to lay out the context in which the Nicaraguan government went to the International Court of Justice in 1984 in response to aggression waged by the United States, which you have already heard about from Dr. Wilfredo Navarro. However, we do need to look into more specifics. Within the framework of the Cold War between the United States and Russia, the Sandinista People's Revolution triumphed in 1979. This caused great unease in the United States within its foreign policy because that country wanted at all costs to prevent Nicaragua's example from spreading. For this reason, and starting in 1981, they implemented the Reagan Doctrine, which sought to resume its hegemony in Latin America through overt and covert actions to prevent social movements from growing stronger. Thus, on November 23, 1981, Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive 17, in which it was agreed to allocate funds to his country's intelligence agencies in order to explicitly support military and paramilitary operations in Nicaragua, also empowering the CIA to recruit, support, and train counter-revolutionary forces under the FDN and ARDE, the Contra Forces, to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. To this end, they created training camps in the neighboring countries, which also Latin American mercenaries hired by the United States joined. In 1982, the Central Intelligence Agency recruited more than 1,000 mercenaries to provide military training to them, and also provided modern communications, equipment, and weapons. That year, the attacks increased and became more destructive than in previous years. This included attacks on the borders, the use of armed force, the use of explosives at airports and in airlines, the destruction of bridges, refineries, the violation of the nation's airspace by military aircraft, the mining of the country's ports, as well as meddling in internal affairs. By the end of 1983, the war had reached the level of conventional war, although it was still called a covert or low-intensity war. This was the context in which Nicaragua, after being a victim of brutal and inhuman armed attacks on military, economic, and civilian targets, decided to go to the International Court of Justice, because Nicaragua, with its long legal tradition, has based its international relations on friendship, solidarity, and reciprocal treatment amongst peoples. Therefore, it recognizes the international principle of peaceful resolution of disputes, international disputes, as established in international law. Over the last 37 years, Nicaragua has been a party or litigant in 12 cases before the International Court of Justice, in addition to other cases in which we have participated as third parties or participated in consultative opinions. After the United States, Nicaragua is the country that has made the most use of this main legal body of the United Nations to resolve controversies in a peaceful way. Given geopolitical circumstances, Nicaragua's border problems have been numerous. However, these circumstances also show us Nicaragua's long legal tradition and its sense of responsibility as a member of the United Nations to adhere to the judgments handed down by the main legal entity of the United Nations on multiple cases in which the counterparts were Honduras, Costa Rica, the United States, and Colombia. Unfortunately, these last two countries are known for their failure to adhere to those judgments and to disregard international law. The suit filed by Nicaragua against the United States, it was on 9 April 1984 when Nicaragua filed suit against the United States of America at the International Court of Justice for having military use against Nicaragua and intervening in the country's internal affairs and sovereignty, as well as violating its territorial integrity, independence, as well as the most fundamental principles and universal principles recognized of international law. Because of the facts based in Nicaragua's application, Nicaragua asked the court to judge and declare, amongst other points, that bearing in mind that these violations of the aforementioned legal obligations, the United States had the express duty to immediately cease and desist from all direct or indirect use of force, be it overt or covert, and the threat of the use of force against Nicaragua. Should also cease all violations of the sovereignty and territorial integrity or political independence of Nicaragua, including all direct or indirect intervention in Nicaragua's internal affairs, and also cease support for any kind of support, including the training, supplying of weapons, munitions, financing, food provisions, aid, or any type of support to any nation, group, organization, movement, or individual that participates in or is willing to participate in military or paramilitary actions in or against Nicaragua, as well as any attempts whose purpose is to restrict, blockade, or endanger the entry and departure of goods from Nicaragua's ports, as well as all of the killings, injuring, and abduction of Nicaraguan citizens. Nicaragua stated that the United States had the obligation to pay Nicaragua for all of the death and damage caused to the citizens of Nicaragua. So is obligated to pay reparations for the injury caused to Nicaraguan persons, property, and economy because of its violations of international law, and this amount is to be determined by the court. Nicaragua reserves the right, however, to introduce before the court a precise assessment of the damages caused by the United States. In that same application, Nicaragua asked the International Court of Justice for urgent provisional measures to protect it, because Nicaragua believed that the continuation of the military and paramilitary activities by the United States against Nicaragua would continue to cause irreparable harm to the population and the country. On May 10, 1984, the court announced its decision on the request for provisional measures by Nicaragua, based on the principle that provisional measures in no way prejudge the jurisdiction or admissibility of the application, because this would be decided at a later stage. and not in that stage as the United States purported. In this regard, the court unanimously rejected the filing of the United States of America to end by deleting from the court's general register this application and suit and the request for provisional measures deposited by the Republic of Nicaragua on 9 April 1984. So the court proceeded to issue the following provisional measures. First, the United States should immediately cease and abstain from any action whose effect is to restrict, block, or endanger the entry and departures from Nicaraguan ports, and in particular, cease the placement of mines. 2, Nicaragua's right to sovereignty and independence should be fully respected and not jeopardized in any way by military and paramilitary activities, because these are prohibited by the principles of international law, particularly by the principle that states should refrain in their international relations from using threats or the actual use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, and based on the relative principle of the duty to not intervene in internal affairs. This decision by the court to grant the provisional measures requested by Nicaragua removed any legitimacy from the war against Nicaragua and ordered the United States to cease its action. And this is a crucial moment from which we can now see what was coming. Jurisdiction and admissibility of Nicaragua's application. Once the provisional measure stage concluded, the court needed to determine whether it had jurisdiction to hear the application from Nicaragua and whether this was within the purview of the court. The United States responded to the application, arguing that the court did not have either jurisdiction or competence to hear the matter for the following reasons. First, that Nicaragua never accepted the mandatory jurisdiction of the court. 2, treaties of friendship, trade, and navigation do not provide a basis for the jurisdiction of the court in this case. And 3, the application filed by Nicaragua was outside the competence of the court and therefore is not admissible. As regards the first argument put forth by the United States to the court, obviously based on Nicaragua's filings, the court concluded that Nicaragua's statement of 24 September 1929 accepting the mandatory jurisdiction of the Permanent Court of International Justice, the precursor of the International Court of Justice, and ratified on 29 November 1939 was valid for the following reasons. As a founding member of the United Nations, Nicaragua had ratified the charter of this new international organization on September 6, 1945, and then became part of the statute of the New World Court. The statement made before the International Permanent Court of Justice was considered by all countries and by the International Court of Justice and by Nicaragua itself meant that this was in effect. Starting at that time and for the following 38 years, the annual books of the International Court of Justice included Nicaragua in the list of countries that had accepted the mandatory jurisdiction of the court, and Nicaragua never objected to such publications. Finally, the United States had argued as that its second motive for inadmissibility, that in its application, Nicaragua was only formulating and reformulating that the United States was making the illicit use of force. However, its actions, that is the actions of the United States, were framed by the legitimate use of collective defense at the request of the countries of the region, Honduras, El Salvador, and Costa Rica, to confront threats to their own security, given the policies and actions of the Nicaraguan government. Because Nicaragua was threatening its neighboring countries by providing weapons to El Salvador and launching armed attacks on its bordering neighbors. Therefore, given all of the accusations of Nicaragua and the collective action of the United States, it was rather the United Nations Security Council that had jurisdiction. The court responded, the fact that a matter may be submitted to the Security Council should not prevent the court from hearing the case, and two proceedings could take place in parallel. The court also stressed that the Security Council has political attributions, whereas the World Court only has judicial ones. The two bodies could therefore carry out separate but complementary functions in light of the same events. On November 26, 1984, the court announced its decision on the matter of jurisdiction and admissibility and decided that it did have jurisdiction and competence to hear the suit that had been filed by Nicaragua and found no reason for this application to be found inadmissible. Reaction of the United States. Once this decision was announced, in an unprecedented attitude, the United States sent the letter to the International Court of Justice on 18 January 1985, part of which stated, that is the relevant part stated, the United States finds itself obliged to conclude from the decision that the decision of the court is clearly erroneous. So they say that they are above international law, both in light of the facts and law, for the reasons indicated in its written and oral submissions. The United States continues to be firmly convinced that the court does not have jurisdiction over this conflict and that the Nicaraguan application is inadmissible. Therefore, it is incumbent upon me to inform you that the United States has decided to not participate in any further proceedings regarding this case and reserves its rights regarding all consequences of any decisions the court may follow through regarding the application from Nicaragua. According to the United States, the application or suit from Nicaragua was a political use of the court. Furthermore, in its communique, the United States not only attacked the court as an institution, but also some of its members, including two judges from the Warsaw Pact countries that never before had been singled out by that country. Because the court's members were representative of all of the legal systems of the world. Judgment. The United States withdrawal did not paralyze the judicial proceedings as is established by the statute of the International Court of Justice, although the court did need to find its own ways to respond to the allegations of fact and law submitted by Nicaragua as the suing party, in addition, the United States had put forth arguments regarding documents, and the court also had to respond to this. So on June 27, 1986, the World Court ruled in favor of Nicaragua and unwaveringly condemned the United States for violating the fundamental principles of international law, both general international law and customary international law. The court's decision was set forth in 16 operative paragraphs, and we will just mention the most relevant ones. Item 2 rejects the United States argument of legitimate self-defense regarding the military and paramilitary activities in against Nicaragua, which are the target of this litigation. In item 3, it decides that by training, arming, equipping, financing, and providing provisions to the Contra forces or in any other way to encourage, support, and help with the execution of military and paramilitary activities against Nicaragua has acted against the Republic of Nicaragua in violation of its obligation under international or customary international law to not intervene in the affairs of another state. In item 6, it decided that, quote, upon placing mines in the territorial waters of the Republic of Nicaragua during the early months of 1984, the United States has violated its obligations as imposed by customary international law to not resort to the use of force against another state, to not intervene in its internal affairs, and to not attack its sovereignty and not interrupt peaceful maritime trade. All of this against Nicaragua. Item 13 of the decision established that the United States has the obligation to pay compensation to Nicaragua for all of the damage caused by its violations of its obligations in accordance with customary international law as cited above. Unfortunately, the sound has cut out. There's no sound. Oh, now its sound has come back. The decision by the International Court of Justice did not set the amount of compensation. It established rather that if the parties could not reach an agreement on same, the court itself would determine the corresponding amount. Position of the United States in light of the judgment. The United States rejected the judgment and decided not to comply with it. By the same token, it did not accept the invitation by Nicaragua to reach a bilateral agreement on compensation. In order to comply with the judgment, Nicaragua in 1986 went to the United Nations Security Council, in which a draft resolution was prepared and presented to the council by members of the non-aligned countries. In that resolution, an urgent call is made to immediately enforce the decision of the International Court of Justice. However, this was vetoed by the United States. Along the same lines, Nicaragua went to the United Nations General Assembly, in which there was an overwhelming approval of a resolution urging the United States to comply with the judgment of the International Court of Justice. Once these options were exhausted, Nicaragua presented to the court on 29 March 1988 its measure of the amount of damages, and this was for $17 billion at that point in time. In addition, on 5 April 1990, the National Assembly of Nicaragua adopted Law 92, which established the obligation of the government of Nicaragua to continue the trial until a judgment on compensation was established. It said its only point was compensation by the United States, or that the United States owes to Nicaragua, is the inalienable patrimony of all Nicaraguan people, and it should be used to pay damages caused by the war, to pay compensations to victims and their relatives, and to allow for the country's material development, to fight overcome the delays and dependency, and improve the living conditions of the population, and have a more just distribution of wealth. However, during the President Violeta Chamorro administration, this law was repealed as an act of submission to the empire. It is an error to believe that with the repeal of Law 92, the case against the United States is closed. This trial can only conclude with direct communication from the government of Nicaragua to the International Court of Justice, which has not occurred. Nicaragua's compensation is still unpaid. While it is true that Nicaragua discontinued the procedure before the court to determine the amount of compensation owed, at no time did it refuse or renounce that payment. The legacy of Father Miguel Viscoto. On February 5, 1993, a diplomatic, politician, and priest of the community leader was born. He was the foreign minister of dignity and defended the peoples of the Americas to live in peace and freedom. He was the president of the 63rd General Assembly of the United Nations from 2008 to 2009. And from that position and his vast diplomatic experience, he knew the United Nations. He knew how the various states interact at the highest level. And given his social and religious commitment, he was committed to acting on behalf of the well-being of all human beings. He said that we needed an organization that would bring all countries together, but he had observed the many failures and shortcomings of the United Nations. Therefore, he issued a proposal titled The Reinvention of the United Nations, which included a proposal for the International Mother Earth Day. The proposal acknowledges that the United Nations was conceived in a period in which the greatest fear was to have an endless cycle of armed conflicts, which would not only prevent humanity from surviving, and in the first decade of the 21st century, this fear is coming true. Unless drastic, brave measures are taken to slow down human aggression against Mother Earth and the poor. So he said that the United Nations, instead of just saving the world from war, the new charter would entrust the United Nations with avoiding extinction of the human species and preserving Mother Earth's capacity to generate and sustain life. He also proposed a change to the unequal structures of the United Nations so that it become a more democratic and independent organization in which the opinions of all are heard, and that these opinions should be taken into account in decision-making processes without excluding anyone, and also to ensure the rule of law, sovereign equality of all states, and to ensure that the United Nations would be more effective, transparent, and participatory. By the same token, the Universal Declaration of Common Good for the Earth and Humanity was proposed by him and approved by 192 member states at the United Nations General Assembly. And this has also become part of positive law in Nicaragua. It was incorporated into our Constitution in Article 60. Those are my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Ramos. That was excellent. And as I said, we'll be looking to you as we move forward with our own litigation. Our next witness is Minister of Finance of Nicaragua, Ivan Acosta. He will be speaking to the effects of illegal coercive measures, sanctions, on Nicaragua's development process since 1981. Thank you very much, Compañero Acosta.
Thank you, honorable members of the International People's Tribunal. Today, we have come to give testimony on the illegal coercive measures on the national economy and development of Nicaragua since 1981. In addition, we also request condemnation of the United States. Peace and justice is not something imperialism done. Peace has never been part of US imperialist policy. Peace and justice hurt the imperialist military industrial business. To the imperialists, peace is intervention and subjugation. On behalf of peace and democracy, liberty and justice, in the name of these things, the imperialists have committed their greatest crimes against humanity. Good morning. Today is June 3rd, 2023, and we are here in Nicaragua attending this 14th hearing of the International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures, which are illegal and illegitimate, as well as unethical. We extend greetings to all of the participants in this hearing to continue to support the right of peoples and nations to build their own societies free of the terror of war and imperialist violence. Within this context, we have come before this tribunal to accuse imperialism in all of its manifestations and expressions. And in this regard, we support the general position of this tribunal that sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures, which are illegitimate, illegal, and unethical, are established by the structures of imperialism and designed by the neo-colonial, neoliberal capitalist order to massively empower their monopolies and Western military industry. What are the historical, legal, and moral and human rights bases that have brought us to make this accusation before this tribunal? First of all, and in particular, our country, Nicaragua, which is free and sovereign, has an entire history of United States intervention. This is the Central American country that has been most invaded by the United States in the 20th century, as we heard from the previous speakers. These interventions have had a decisive impact on the accumulated level of poverty throughout the 20th century. Ours is the poorest country of Central America with the highest concentration of wealth at the top, and in which 50% of the land was held by just 2% of the population. Illiteracy was above 57%. The mortality rates for infants and mothers were very high, and ours was a country that was occupied by and in which the National Guard had forces of 15,000 for less than 3,000 people. Is probably the highest per capita rate of repression in the world. At the time of the triumph of the revolution, hope came to our people, and we believed that we could build a new order, a new model for the development. But certainly this must have been seen as a bad example by the Reagan administration, and so they organized and financed the counter-revolutionary forces, and they put them together, and this marked the loss of lives of more than 50,000 Nicaraguans in a country of just about 3 million people. With this war, the United States also imposed an economic blockade on Nicaragua at a rate of unprecedented level. This impacted our exports to our leading market in the United States, and we had about 70% loss. And this was dropped to less than half. And this sought to destroy the state's ability to bring about development and reduce poverty, extreme poverty, and to also put an end to the scourges inherited by the long Somoza dictatorship, which had been upheld by the government of the United States. The Reagan administration accelerated the destruction of the economy and also financed and put together the counter-revolution. And they also decreed economic sanctions and an embargo on Nicaragua, such as those that had been promoted in the multilateral organizations. We recall the suspension of funding for wheat financed by the Inter-American Development Bank in order to cause hunger in the country. But this was not achieved because of our capacity to struggle and build and organize people under the Sandinista Front for Liberation under the presidency of President Ortega. This was done under the Contadora Group and the Manzanillo talks. And we also promoted the Esquipulas Agreement, Esquipulas 1 and 2, as well as the Sapua Agreement. All of this to bring about peace. But Nicaragua ultimately went to what we required, which was dialogue to try to find a way out of these military and paramilitary conflicts. First, we went to The Hague, to the World Court, and won, as we heard from the previous speaker. So how much were the damages estimated by international organizations? As of 1987, the damages were estimated at over $17 billion. Which, and at present value, would be more or less $50 billion in damages, which is 3 times the current GDP. Therefore, during the 1981 to 1990 period, they destroyed, they looked at the opportunity to build roads, to establish electricity, to expand health services, to improve and have better quality education. And so ultimately, the war of aggression expressed through the military organization, through the Contras and all of the economic damages, laid the country's economy at its knees. And this meant that there was a change. In other words, we went to the 1990 elections with a gun aimed at our heads. We never saw the defeat of a revolution without being accompanied by a tremendous war of aggression and the economic prostration of the country. In 1990, we also had to quantify damages to the economy because of these economic adjustment measures and structural adjustment measures promoted by financial agencies in which the United States is the largest shareholder. So public services shrank. The state was reduced to its minimum expression after 1990, and people left public services. People were left unemployed. This interrupted the chain of production, and also public health and public education were decimated, and there was a dismantling of the entire capacity for rural development. And this also fundamentally increased extreme poverty and poverty in the countryside. Illiteracy rebounded in large numbers, and was the biggest exodus in our country's history, the biggest exodus to the United States. People talk a lot about migration, but our exodus was in the 1990s because of these neoliberal policies. Then the government in 2006, there was a proposal for reconciliation and national reconciliation for construction and development. And above all, the FSLN proposed a fight against poverty and for human development. This in 2007, once the Sandinista front returned to the presidency under Daniel Ortega, we began a reconstruction of the country, a reconstruction of our social model, and a push in the fight against poverty. We put together public goods and infrastructure at levels never seen before. And we put together the anti-poverty programs which meant increasing public spending by more than 10% for the fight against poverty and for social spending, and education and health were prioritized. Also, drinking water and sanitation and bringing electricity to homes. And there are results that are recognized by international organizations and experts. And we are very proud that we have had the quickest reduction in poverty and extreme poverty over the last 10 years. Went from 41.3% to 24.9%. That's general poverty. And 17.6% to 7.9% was the reduction in extreme poverty. And so this was achieved based on public policies on the right path, such as allocating resources with citizen participation, social mobilization to reduce illiteracy, expand the health model based in communities, and to do public works, construction, and to really channel resources to the countryside where historically the poorest people in Nicaragua are found. We build roads to the rural areas. We provided electricity to rural areas. And once again, we financed production. We financed production in order to strengthen, first of all, food security and food sovereignty. We must recall that it's an economic model. If you have an economic model without public policies that ensure food for the people, without food security, the ones who are going to go hungry first are going to be the peasants who have been excluded from the model of production. Therefore, it was extremely important to go back to the countryside with policies such as the production bonus and zero usury, which meant giving capital to the poorest of the poor. And in order to have an impact, a relevant, real impact on issues related to poverty reduction and reducing extreme poverty, and to reactivate and relaunch the production model within the country between 2007 and 2021, we have quintupled the country's exports in order to improve our economic standing. So probably or certainly the sex of President Ortega's administration from 2007 to 2017, which was the best decade in the country's history since independence, the greatest reduction of poverty, the greatest reduction of achieving the Millennium Development Goals, such as maternal and child mortality, and also having been able to double the GDP of the country and per capita GDP. In other words, the country was getting less and less poor every day thanks to these public policies. This is most likely what encouraged the new round of aggression in 2018. Aggression, which is essentially laid out in the manuals on soft coups. But for Nicaragua, it was violent and it was profound and destroyed more than $24 billion worth of goods, added to the $50 billion from the 1980s. This means that US imperialism has destroyed Nicaragua's per capita GDP fivefold. In other words, we have lost $10 billion per capita per citizen as a result of the consecutive aggressions from 1981 until today. Now, after this aggression, which implied death and pain, encouraged from outside the country and organized from the outside, sponsored by organizations and institutions that are directly financed by the United States, just like in the counter-revolution in the 1980s, when they organized and funded the counter-revolution. There is no difference in their attitude. There is no change in the imperialist policy. They are against the people. They are against freedom. They are against our development, and they are against our independence.
That's why, in a definitive sense, before their failure in the coup attempt, imposing unilateral coercive measures, sanctions, laws, and decrees to hurt the Nicaraguan people. What are the main laws that have been pushed forward? A law that's been called the Anti-Corruption Law of Nicaragua. Of institutions like Inter-American Development Bank, the Magnitsky Law, also the European Union, which has sanctioned 32 people. Has been carried out in order to prevent the institutional structure of the country from generating goods and services to satisfy the human needs of the Nicaraguan population. The United States is pressuring Nicaragua with possible reductions of the benefits of the CAFTA free trade agreement in the mark of the law Renacer, which was approved and signed by President Biden in November 2021, indicating the revision of the participation of Nicaraguan products in free trade between these countries. The United States and its allies has applied restrictions on international investment in Nicaragua through intimidation and disinformation to limit businesses and foreign investors, particularly of U.S. origin, from investing in Nicaragua. At least 26 projects, including from the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, Exim Bank of Korea, have been affected, which has reduced the amount of investment from 819 million in 2014 to 2017 to 291 million in the period of 2018 to 21. This particularly affects certain areas, the Caribbean coast, the food available in schools for vulnerable populations. So for those people like the Afro-Nicaraguans of the Caribbean coast who have been dealing with poverty and exclusion for over 200 years, they deal with it again in the name of democracy based on this imposition by the United States. The development of the childhood, the access of the Nicaraguan population to potable water in rural zones, the access of small scale and medium scale farmers to be able to get to markets. These farmers don't have friends in high places and banks. They need public policy to be able to maintain themselves. The United States vetoed in the World Bank a study of the dry sector, the dry corridor, which would have had as a result financing for approximately $80 million that would have supported 800,000 people that live in this zone, which is part of the Mesoamerican dry corridor. These $80 million would have gone towards supporting the poorest people in our country. But this is also the incompletion of the supposed commitment of the United States against poverty and to support and share prosperity. The government of President Ortega will find the way to put resources into the quality of life of poor people in Nicaragua. Somehow or another, they'll find it. The United States, together with the extinct Grupo de Lima, paralyzed in the Inter-American Development Bank important projects that were on the table to be financed in Nicaragua, including the road between La Esperanza and Huapi and the highway of Muelle de Builue, which includes a pier that was destroyed in the hurricanes of 2020. The maneuvers of the United States in the Inter-American Development Bank are based on the non-use of based on making the Nicaraguan national strategy inoperable because of the veto of the United States within that bank, which has had an impact of more than $1 billion not arriving to the population. Between 2010 to 2017, there's been a contraction of the money received from the Inter-American Development Bank from $1.124 billion to only $43 million between 2018 and 2022. With these resources, we would have been able to build 265 new kilometers of highway, 4 high-quality hospitals worth approximately $62 million each. This is a shame of the United States. This is a shame because these includes infrastructure that was destroyed in hurricanes that we've been unable to rebuild. These 4 hospitals worth $62 million each in the improvement of drinking water systems in 2 department heads would have been extraordinarily important. In 2021, Nicaragua exported 465,310 metric tons of sugar, 50% of which was destined to the U.S. market, which was the initial quota that the United States gave to Nicaragua. But based on since 2023, Nicaragua has not been able to export 22,114 metric tons of sugar to the United States. Based on the agreements in the Uruguay round of the World Trade Organization, the United States has the commitment to bring in 1.11 million tons from 40 countries, including Nicaragua. The coercive measures and sanctions in reality affect directly against the population, especially the most poor. Nicaragua is respectful of international rights and demands reciprocity. We fight for a multipolar world with justice, equality, and solidarity, which reduces poverty and inequalities in the world. We will continue to resolutely defend peace and to implement our model of a development that's Christian and in solidarity for the well-being of our families and communities. This is why we demand an immediate end to all sanctions and coercive economic measures that these, whether these be unilateral, bilateral, or multilateral, applied in any country of the world, and we demand the right of all people to decide their future without any foreign interference. There's many challenges that humanity has to overcome together, particularly poverty and climate change. So there's no route that would try to maintain hegemony, which is in decadence and is only bringing suffering to the people of the planet. Keeping in mind that these coercive economic measures and sanctions are a measure to discipline and control the sovereignty of the people and block the emergence of a multipolar world order. They're a form of ferocious violence. They're an arm of the United States and other countries that use them to punish nations that decline to be submitted to the United States and Europe. They're a new form of imperialist war that kills and vulnerates human life. And they're an immoral and nefast way of destabilizing the economies of the countries that they are applied to. We've been able to have victory in the social field, victory in the economic field, despite all of these efforts that have been applied to us. We've been trying to recover our economic capacities, our budget capacities. We will continue to mobilize resources to our social needs, to the struggle against poverty. Where we see that public policy pushed by President Ortega are effective, the poverty continues to be reduced, food sovereignty continues to be strengthened, education and health continue to improve. We're also improving the living standards in the countryside, where there is the most poverty in our country. Esteemed members of this International Popular Tribunal, activist groups, academics, internationalists, anti-imperialists, and pacifists, we direct our words to you because the people of Nicaragua and its political leadership are convinced that the only form of defeating this illegal sanctions and coercive economic measures implemented majorly by the United States and the European Union is by building an international consensus about the illegality of these decisions and unilateral measures, whether they be unilateral, bilateral, or multinational, and the urgent need of taking legal actions against this spurious attitude that violates international rights and human dignity. We will close by expressing that the best attitude of the people is to condemn, as we are doing in this tribunal, firmly imperialism and its corollaries for the damage that they've caused through their policy of sanctions and economic coercive measures that have been implemented. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. That was very rich. And we especially appreciate that you all have called out the role of not just unilateral coercive measures, but also multilateral coercive measures, which is also something that we will be pursuing, hopefully. Our next esteemed speaker is Dr. Sonia Castro, MD. She's a health advisor to the president and the former Minister of Health, and was sanctioned herself in 2018. And she will be speaking to the impacts of multilateral coercive measures, economic coercive measures on the health sector. Welcome, Dr. Castro.
The effects of illegal coercive measures of the United States upon the health sector of Nicaragua. The historically denounced, accused, and condemned Yankees. Please receive the warmest greeting from the land of lakes and volcanoes, the land of Andres Castro, Benjamin Celedon, Agosto Sandino, and our universal poet, Rubén Darío. I will present the effects of the aggressions of Yankee imperialism upon the health of Nicaraguan people. Since the beginning of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th, Nicaragua has been the victim of military aggressions of the United States, which affected the lack of development in the healthcare system through its military presence by installing its own model of health. The US government froze the national development that General Jose Santos Zelaya, national hero, promoted as president by imposing a policy of domination upon the Nicaraguan society, suffocating all efforts to struggle in favor of self-determination. This intervention of the United States deepened inequalities and tried to humiliate the Nicaraguan people. But also what it did do was create efforts of dignity and sovereignty like that of General Benjamin Celedon and the blessed and divine struggle of our general of free women and men, Agosto Sandino, through which Nicaraguan history changed forever. Both of them were assassinated and immortalized by Yankee imperialism. This criminal intervention of imperialism of the United States did not allow the development of our own health system that would respond to the needs of the Nicaraguan population. We accuse the United States for being responsible of blocking the aspirations of Nicaraguans in the construction and development of a healthcare model with equality and social justice. The United States imposed the Somoza dictatorship to continue with the political hegemony in Nicaragua and in the region, which deepened the lack of attention towards the health of our people. During the 45 years of the Somoza dictatorship imposed by the Yankees, there was in this country a system of abandonment and deterioration of public health. For the Somoza system, healthcare was a privilege. In 1957, Social Security was founded, which gave a scarce coverage to a few workers in the cities, leaving farm workers without protection of their health and making the gap between healthcare in the city and the countryside even deeper. The criminal and premeditated disinterest of the dictatorship brought as a consequence at the end of the 1970s, the healthcare situation was zero investment in health infrastructure. 120 children per 1,000 died before 5 years. The infant mortality rate of 120. 83% of the infant population suffered at least some level of malnutrition, diarrhea, pastocytosis, preventable diseases were the main causes of death in Nicaraguan children. There was no concern for the health of Nicaraguan women. For all this damage to the life and the health of the Nicaraguan people, we denounce, accuse, and condemn the government of the United States. With the triumph of the Sandinista Revolution, the Nicaraguan people, for the first time, achieved the right to health as a human right. However, the United States, through its direct creation of a war of aggression and its criminal blockade, did not allow our own healthcare model to be developed and advanced. For that reason, again, we denounce, accuse, and condemn the government of the United States. From 1979 on, health became a priority, seeing it as a human right, and the National Unified Healthcare System was created, where the Sandinista state took on the responsibility to guarantee universal access, universal and free access to healthcare for the population through the promotion of health, prevention, attention, rehabilitation. Also, there were popular campaigns of healthcare, of massive vaccine campaigns, campaigns of environmental hygiene and medication to control malaria.
Wow.
Polio was eradicated. Infant mortality was brought down from 120 children per 1,000 dead to 57 at the end of the 1980s. There was a promotion and growth of the number of general doctors and specialists who graduated from our universities, chiefly children of workers and peasants, in addition to more healthcare workers of all kinds. The Sandinista healthcare model stimulated the participation of all of the institutions of the state in the community through brigades for the protection of the health of the communities. The Yankees, through the government of Ronald Reagan, acted criminally against the health and life of the Nicaraguan people. In addition to imposing the violent deaths of war as the principal cause of mortality, the war of aggression affected the health of the entire population because it was the cause of malnutrition in the rural areas, especially in children, because it made it more difficult to plant, to harvest, and to store foods. They destroyed healthcare buildings, and they tried to create a absence of food and medicine. Once again, we denounce, accuse, and condemn the North American government for having caused damage to the health of the people of Nicaragua. In the 1990s, the United States continued to be responsible for pushing forward neoliberal policies that took away from our people its right to healthcare, privatizing healthcare attention and reducing investment in healthcare. Neoliberal governments started to charge for healthcare services, reducing the budget for healthcare in half and privatizing what was left of it. All this created a deterioration in healthcare infrastructure and the loss of access to medicine by the Nicaraguan population, to such a point that the majority of Nicaraguans had to reduce their purchase of food in order to buy medicine. However, the Nicaraguan people in the Sandinista struggle maintain the healthcare model of the 1980s, and for all of this damage, we point to the United States government as responsible. The 1990s was marked by neoliberal governments which were guided by North American imperialism, which tried to dismantle the achievements of the Sandinista revolution, privatizing healthcare, reducing the number of workers, pulling investment away from infrastructure and healthcare technology, closing healthcare facilities throughout the countryside, and abandoning the model of participation of the community in the healthcare, which led to a drop in the vaccine coverage of the population, especially among children, a resurgence of epidemias like cholera, the growth of the infant mortality rate, again, an elevated maternal mortality rate, higher levels of malnutrition, especially in the rural areas, loss of a budget destined to healthcare. By 2005, only 40% of the Nicaraguan population had access to essential medicines because 2/3 of the expense in medicine was assumed by families and not by the state. There was a deterioration of healthcare infrastructure, and there was a reduction of the participation of the community in healthcare. So again, we accuse, denounce, and condemn the government of the United States for this. After 2006, we entered into the second era of the Sandinista revolution, rescuing the principle of healthcare as a right, through which, with our current model of family and community health, there's been an important investment for the creation of new healthcare facilities and improvement of those that exist. However, the United States, only a few years later, conspired and financed a failed coup attempt, which directly affected the life and health of Nicaraguans. In 2018, the US government, with the participation of sellouts, organized and financed a coup attempt with terrorist actions that directly caused the death of many Nicaraguans, closing highways with roadblocks of death in which Nicaraguans were assassinated, in preventing the voyage of sick people who were trying to get to hospitals and healthcare facilities. Additionally, 61 vehicles of the Ministry of Health were destroyed and torn apart. They tried to burn the Fernando Vélez Páez Hospital, a new hospital, the most modern in that moment, which was constructed. And they also ransacked the National Warehouse of Medical Inputs. For all of this destruction of the goods of our people, for the assassination of our sisters and brothers, and for the deterioration of health, we denounce, accuse, and condemn the United States. In the year 2020, we confronted a pandemic in the midst of illegal coercive measures of the United States towards the Nicaraguan people, in which we had to struggle against the limitations in access to breathing equipment, vaccines, inputs, and medicine for the attention of our population against this illness. The United States and other imperialist countries, with their foreign policy, took actions of which we would consider crimes against humanity in these critical moments of the pandemic to prevent us from accessing necessary equipment and making the cost of this equipment between 10 and 20 times their normal cost. The search for financing among international multilateral organisms in order to confront the pandemic was only effective a year later because of a conditioning rule to include predetermined organizations as administrators of the funds, which meant delays in the processes of purchase, not to mention the elevated costs by these organizations. The hoarding of vaccines against COVID-19 by the United States and other countries, in addition to lies and false news affecting mental health because of a circulation of lies and exaggerated stats about deaths by the virus, which was circulated in our country, produced by henchmen of the empire, tried to undermine the trust that our population would have in our government in that context. Despite this blockade of the United States towards Nicaragua, the lack of immediate financing and the lack of insumos, the lack of supplies, the Sandinista government was able to confront this pandemic successfully. With this testimony that takes on different moments of the history of our country, we denounce, accuse, and condemn Yankee imperialism and the government of the United States for its responsibility of the damage of the past and the present against the health of our people.
Thank you all very, very much to our esteemed speakers. We've done many hearings now, but collectively you are one of our first set of speakers that has actually spoken to the process of rebuilding and redevelopment and liberation after the end of US imperialism. And so for that, we really, really appreciate your testimony. And to our audience members, next week when we have our Cuba hearing, we expect that it will be, that will also cover the process of rebuilding and development after liberation. I am now happy to present and honored to present our last speaker, Compañero Camilo Mejia. He's a Nicaraguan activist living in the United States, and he will discuss US-financed aggressions against Nicaragua to foment the failed coup attempt in 2018. So not so long ago, for people who don't know, there was a coup attempt as recently as 2018, as well as to finance fake news campaigns through both social media and traditional news networks. Thank you very much, and welcome, Camilo.
Thank you, and good morning, brothers and sisters, members of the International People's Tribunal. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present my testimony. I would like to start with a brief overview of my life to let you know about what the U.S. empire has done against my country, Nicaragua. My name is Camilo Mejia. I was born in August of 1975 in Nicaragua under the Somoza regime. My parents were part of the Sandinista movement to overthrow the dictatorship, and later they worked in the government. I lived in Nicaragua for the following 11 years of my life. After the Sandinista government lost the general elections of 1990, my mother decided to move to Costa Rica and later to the United States, where I completed my high school education. I also took 2 semesters at the university, and later I signed up for the U.S. Army. In 2003, they sent me and my unit to Iraq, where my first mission was to direct a prisoner of war camp in which they taught us techniques of psychological torture to deprive prisoners of sleep. I spent most of the time in the site of our 3rd mission in the city of Ar-Ramadi, where we entered into combat with the Iraqi resistance, and we killed about 32 people during the combat operations. All of them were civilians. The number of deaths is an unofficial estimate because the US policy was to not count Iraqi deaths. 70 months after my deployment, I was given a 2-week furlough to go home to the United States. During that time, I decided to not return to my unit in Iraq because of the war crimes that I had witnessed and participated in. On March 15, 2004, I denounced the illegal war, and I proclaimed myself to be a conscientious objector. During a press conference, I turned myself in at a military base, and 2 months, and then I was found guilty of desertion, and I was sentenced to 12 months of imprisonment. This decision led Amnesty International to declare me to be a prisoner of conscience of the government of the United States. I was imprisoned for 9 months, and I became an anti-war activist in the movement of war veterans right after my release in 2005. I wrote a book about my experiences in the Army and the Iraq War, and I spent the following years working as a writer and activist. During that time, I had a good working relationship with Amnesty International and collaborated with that organization in several events. When the war in Syria began in 2011, I began to note discrepancies in the information coming from Western media outlets. My military training and experience helped me to identify false fake news about alleged bombing on civilian targets by Bashar al-Assad's army. Based on my training and experience with nuclear, biological, and chemical protocols, I began to notice the fake news invented by the Western media about alleged chemical attacks on civilians by the Iraqi army. I began to read the reports from the United Nations weapons inspectors in which they alleged the use of chemical weapons. And I realized that these accusations were being invented with the aid of non-governmental organizations financed by Western governments, development agencies, and philanthropic entities from the West. All of these nonprofit organizations, including Amnesty International, were involved in this in 2014. I saw a similar situation in Ukraine. when Western governments and media financed and collaborated with non-profit and human rights agencies to tell a story about a violent uprising as instead a peaceful movement in order to overthrow the democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych. I then began to closely study how the United States and its Western allies were using civil society and human rights organizations in close collaboration with the main Western businesses and social media to carry out regime change operations throughout the world. When I heard about the protests in Nicaragua for the first time in April of 2018, my first impression was that these were peaceful protests in reaction to the government's retirement system, and I didn't pay much attention. But as days went by, I began to hear that the Nicaraguan government was killing peaceful protesters, and I began to pay more attention to the images that were shared on social media, and which also began to appear on the internet and Western media. I saw that in Nicaragua, an operation very similar to what I had already seen in Syria and Ukraine, which is taking place. Once again, my military training and combat experience in Iraq helped me to identify the false flag operations that were being sent around the world as evidence of government oppression. In one case, an alleged student massacre by the government was posted on a Facebook news site. But the site was completely new and it wasn't connected to any official media outlet. This news item accused the police of using AK-47 rifles to kill students. However, the images lacked authenticity and the seriousness of this kind of situation. There was no blood. The students supposedly with bullet wounds were continuously looking at their cell phones. The people didn't have any medical equipment. There was no one in charge, and people were doing their day-to-day activities behind them. And people transmitting this were sending their message directly to the United Nations and the international community, begging them to do something about the killing, just as I had seen in coverage on Syria and Ukraine. There were images that showed people who were wounded and were bleeding, dying, because of the but the coverage blamed the government without any context. This reminded me of the scenes that I had seen of the uprising in Ukraine, in which sharpshooters or snipers were opening fire on police officers and demonstrators, creating confusion and fueling more violence. There were also images of police and known Sandinista activists who were tortured, shot, wounded, and of dead bodies being burned alive. But this did not appear in the Western media, nor in the human rights reports. If they had been, or if they were alleged to be deaths on the side of the opposition, and they attributed their deaths to government or Sandinista violence. When I was able to check out the facts and get a clear idea of the deception that was taking place, I felt a need to do something about it. I wrote an open letter to Amnesty International and got it published in several independent media outlets in English and Spanish. The title of the letter is an open letter to Amnesty International about Nicaragua, from an ex-prisoner of conscience of Amnesty International. Amnesty's response came in a few days later, but it did not address any of the fake news reports that they had included in their report. They simply said that they were committed to the truth and human rights. As of today, they have continued to provide biased, partial, manipulated information. I have continued to investigate and learn more about how the United States has been carrying out regime change operations in Nicaragua and other parts of the world. I realized that the regime change design that they use today has been improved, but it is nothing new. Many of the tactics to get people to turn against their government, even though it may be just for a limited time, had already been used in the past in places such as Iran, China, and throughout the Arab world and in Eastern Europe. But the vehicle for these tacticals had a new face and a new name, and had found a new home in the human rights organizations and civil society organizations financed by the US and Europe, which now can reach millions of people almost instantaneously, thanks to the complicity of large tech companies and global media. This new regime change design, promoted by civil society organizations and human rights and media outfits, is financed in large measure by an organization that was created to clean up the image of the CIA's regime change operations, which include violence, military coups d'etats, and murders, assassinations. The name of that organization is the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED in its acronym. It was created in 1983 to openly do the work that had been done covertly by the CIA in the past. Shortly after its creation, the NED began to fund Nicaraguan opposition media to publish lies about the Sandinista government and isolate it internationally. One of the first Nicaraguan recipients of NED monies in 1983 was the Chamorro family and their newspaper, La Prensa. That same family received NED funding to carry out a regime change operation in 2018. These funds are channeled through several of the foundations and companies controlled by the family to be distributed to a large number of nonprofits and media outlets in support of the false flag operations aimed at overthrowing our government. One of the first recipients of the NED funding shortly after its creation was the Nicaraguan Association for Human Rights, ANPDH, which received funds in 1986 to conceal the atrocities of the Contra against the Nicaraguan people. That same year, as we have heard, the International Court of Criminal Court in The Hague declared the United States guilty, or rather we heard this from the International Court in The Hague, found the US guilty of funding the Contras and mining Nicaragua's harbors. The ANPDH is one of the organizations that provided fake news to the international media to help the failed coup attempt of 2018. The ANPDH and other human rights organizations and civil society groups headed the attempted coup and received money from the NED, the USAID, and other governments and foundations in the United States and the European Union. In the financial records of these entities, as well as in articles for their beneficiaries, one can find detailed accounts of this funding. One example is an article written by a man called Benjamin Waddell. This was published in the magazine Global Americans. The title of the article alludes to the 2018 protests in Nicaragua. It is called Paving the Way for Insurrection, a closer look at the role of the United States in the social upheaval of Nicaragua. It refers to the use of NED funding to overthrow the Sandinista government. Waddell concludes, the NED's participation in Nicaragua reveals the potential of transnational funding to help cultivate the type of skills, networks, and strategies needed for civil society to successfully challenge authoritarian governments, regardless of what opinion people might have of the ethical aspects of this. The current participation of the NED in fostering civil society groups in Nicaragua sheds a light on the power of transnational finance to influence political outcomes in the 21st century. I understand that the idea of these non-governmental progressive organizations found and developed under the appearance of altruistic ideals can serve as the launch point of Western regime change efforts anywhere in the world, which is incredible. But this means that regime change in the 21st century is very powerful and hard to see and to oppose. I share the quote from this magazine to show that the information that I've included in my testimony is not any secret. The financing and training of civil society groups and human rights organizations can all be found in official records accessible to anyone. The collaboration of civil society NGOs with aid of the United States government agencies is also well documented and accessible. Detailed plans to carry out regime change in Nicaragua, including the names of the entities implied, the financing mechanisms, the political, economic, and social context of the various regime change scenarios are all available for whoever wants to see it. It is visible to everyone. One example of this is what is known as RAIN, Reactive Assistance in Nicaragua. Reactive Assistance in Nicaragua, which gives details for regime change plans in Nicaragua. I will conclude by clarifying that I do not and never have worked for the government of Nicaragua. I am here of my own free will. No one has paid me for this. I am here because I want Nicaragua and the Nicaraguan people to continue to be free and independent. Although I've never been an official member of the Sandinista party, I am Sandinista and I support my government, and I will continue to be Sandinista until the day I die, because being a Sandinista is the highest expression of love that I can profess to my country and my people. Thank you very much for listening to my testimony.
Thank you so much, dear Camilo, for your insightful and very important testimony, and for drawing on the connections of many countries that you've mentioned that we have been covering in the tribunal. This is such an important context, so thank you so much. I'd also like to express my deepest gratitude on behalf of the International People's Tribunal to all of our incredible witnesses for enriching us today with their knowledge and for making today such a powerful and really, really important hearing in the tribunal. As an international law scholar, I've always learned and taught the important legal victories of Nicaragua against the US and its significant role in making and remaking international law. So it is truly an honor to hear from all of you today and to engage with the people with such a long history of not only fighting US imperialism, but defeating US imperialism. And we will continue to learn from you, your role and your leadership in this struggle. I'd also like to thank our amazing interpreters today, Niels, Jill, and Ali, for making today accessible in different languages so that we can cater to our audience and our jurors and everyone internationally. We are honored to have a high number of jurors today in the room. I just want to say a big, big thanks to all of them for being here and for staying on. We know that it's some of them are joining us from very different time zones today. So we really, really appreciate your presence and your participation. I'm afraid we're going to have to limit our question to one juror, to one question per one juror, unfortunately, as much as we would love to have a longer conversation about this. But to make sure that everyone's able to participate fully, we're going to have to do that. And without further ado, I'm going to call on our first juror. If you don't have any questions or comments, we can please pass it on. That's no problem at all. And we will have further opportunities to engage with our witnesses as well. But I'm going to start with Professor Patnaik.
No, I just wish to thank all the persons who gave testimony. It was a brilliant set of testimonies, and I've learned a great deal from them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Mohammed Tai.
اقترح انه تحديد التعويضات بدقه حتى يمكن الكلام عنها، ووقائع ما بعد حكم محكمة العدل الدولية وما أدلى به أمانة العدل الدولية يجب أن يعرض علينا، ولتقديم الوثائق التي جرى الحديث عنها. هل هذا ممكن أو شكرا؟
My question is about the convention. That the international law has asked to be paid for the Nicaraguan government, and about the documents that you should provide us about the international law, international tribunal. No, I think this.
Thank you so much. Sorry, Ali, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Okay. Dr. Tai asked about the amount of compensation that the United States government should pay to the government of Nicaragua, and about the document that must be provided to us on the night of the decision of international law tribunal. I think he asked about that. Thank you.
All right, so for those who have not heard the question, Professor Tai is asking about the amount of compensation that Nicaragua is owed by the United States, an estimate number or any documents that you will be providing to the International People's Tribunal regarding this. Do we have anyone who would like to take this question?
Thank you very much for the question. After the 1986 decision, and when no specific figure had been set by the World Court in The Hague, the Nicaraguan government requested technical support from ECLAC to quantify the amount of the physical damages to infrastructure and damages to production, lost wages, as well as the impact in terms of human lives. As of 1986, that amount was $17 billion. Without taking into account that the war continued into 87, 88, 89. So as of 86, this amount was set by specialists from the United Nations at 17 billion. If we look at inflation in the United States from 86 or 87 through 2021, that economic amount at present values would be around $50 billion. That is the debt that the United States has to Nicaragua for damages caused by the irrational war imposed by the Reagan doctrine on our country. In other words, 3 times the current GDP. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Edre, Eulalia, do you have any questions for our witnesses?
Not really, Elia, but I'd like to share 2 quick reflections, if I may.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
please go ahead.
Well, one is that it highlights further to the Nicaraguan experience the insidious design of using civil society organizations for nefarious. That is very disturbing, considering that in the world, civil people rather than for just imperialists. Yeah. Am I breaking up? Okay. And the second one is, while we do congratulate our Nicaraguan friends and comrades for their successful legal remedies that they sought, we should also take into account the limitations of the existing legal remedies, and that would impact on our future plans after the tribunal has concluded its investigations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Idre. Jerry Boo, do you have any thoughts or questions that you would like to share?
Thank you so much. Just like my comrade who spoke previously, I don't really have any questions, but I just want to wrap my virtual arms around all of the courageous comrades who've come forward with this testimony that is both disturbing and insightful for us as revolutionaries here in the belly of the beast. The only thing I would add is my ongoing request that we develop a comprehensive list of the corporate rogues and those who are culpable for all of the heinous crimes that have been spoken to. We need a list of the banks that are involved and the corporations that we need to be targeting in the United States in support and in solidarity of this ongoing struggle to maintain this revolution. So solidarity and familyhood to everyone, and let's develop a list so that we can properly target those who are still committing these crimes.
Thank you so very much, Jerry Boo. I'm going to call on Marjorie if you have any questions.
Yes, I don't have any questions, but I want to thank all of the brave speakers for their comprehensive and disturbing testimonies, but thank them also for providing us with tools of information that we can use to struggle against the aggression of the United States and its allies against the people's struggles. And this has been a theme throughout all of these hearings for the tribunal, and I really appreciate all of your participation and look forward to eventually our report and any litigation that we can take using the tools of international law to support the struggles of the Nicaraguan people. Thank you. Gracias. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much. I'll call on Jeannie next if you have any thoughts or questions that you'd like to share. Okay, we can come back to Jeannie if they would like to unmute later. Michael, are you still here with us? Would you like to share your thoughts or question? I'm trying to see if Michael is trying to unmute himself. All right, why don't we move to Victor? If Victor, can you hear us? Do you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share? All right. I also see Suzanne Adeli, one of our jurors and a steering committee member in the room. Suzanne, do you have any questions or comments for our witnesses?
I just have a short comment. I want to echo all of our colleagues and express my gratitude for all the energy that you put into today's hearing. I agree with Jaribu. It was disturbing, but also very informative and enlightening. And I think will be very valuable as a political tool, which is certainly one of the goals of this tribunal, right? I think that in many ways, especially with the new generation of anti-imperialists in the US, there's been a lot of efforts at misinformation around what is happening in Nicaragua, and this is very useful. And you know, that's kind of been a common theme, I think, in some of the country hearings is like, in addition to the economic coercive measures themselves, is kind of the war of ideas, and also, you know, trying to really navigate through and challenge imperialist media, and then also, you know, the role that NGOs, both within Nicaragua and based in the United States, and including that also some US-based unions, etc., and the role that those kinds of institutions and entities have played in these types of histories, I think sometimes is understated. And so thank you for bringing that in. And yes, in addition, I agree also with Jaribu's request to try to access list of not only banks, but corporations that are complicit. And additionally, you know, I think the presentation on the history was very valuable, and especially sort of naming some of the US politicians that were central to this is also really important. So thank you again. Thank you, Helia.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I'd like to thank all of you, for all of our jurors, for being here today and for your participation. We have hit the 3-hour mark. I'm gonna have one last call if anyone would like to share any final thoughts or questions. All right, wonderful. Thank you all so much. Please don't forget to join us next week for our 2-day hearing on Cuba. We have several steering committee members who have traveled to Cuba to make sure that we organize this and we work closely with people on the ground. So it'll be a very powerful and excellent hearing. Another one, I would like to again really thank our witnesses today, our interpreters, and everyone in the room. As beautiful, one of our witnesses beautifully put, I'm going to finish by saying, long live the free, sovereign, and blessed people and land of Nicaragua. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next week.
Long live, long live. Bye-bye.